Hello and welcome to another episode of Maritime Mishaps, the channel which investigates the largest, strangest, and most tragic maritime disasters ever to have occurred, as well as the lesser-known events that are equally harrowing in nature. We all know the story of the RMS Titanic, the British ocean liner that sank on the 15th of April, 1912, after it collided with an iceberg on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City. Blockbuster films, diary entries, and, more recently, the unfortunate case of the Titan submersible implosion have kept Titanic in our hearts, minds, and television screens over the years. However, not many people know of another tragic event that took place just 2 years after the Titanic sank, the story of the Empress of Ireland. Having set sail from Liverpool, the liner would come into contact with an oncoming entity and sink into the St. Lawrence River in Canada. Although, on this occasion, it would not be an iceberg, but another ocean liner. What happened that day in 1914 that resulted in the deaths of more than 1,000 people? Who was responsible for such a large-scale collision? And what was the fallout from the catastrophic event? Join us on this episode as we aim to investigate and shed light on the lesser-known story of the Forgotten Empress of Ireland. Before we dive into the chaos, destruction, and tragedy that occurred in May of 1914, we must first understand the events, personnel, and ship in question before she set sail on her doomed voyage towards North America. The Empress of Ireland and her sister, the Empress of Britain, were specifically constructed passenger liners built by Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering in Govan, Scotland. They were the first of their kind to be responsible for the Canadian Pacific Line's growing emigrant trade from Liverpool to Canada. Both vessels were able to commute a weekly service from the northwest of England to the Great White North from May 1906 and became extremely popular with both countries, outclassing and superseding their fellow maritime competitors. Both ships were equal in design, the Empress of Ireland herself measuring 570 feet and 549 feet between perpendiculars. Her beam was 66 feet, with a depth of 37 feet, and had twin four-bladed propellers, each driven by a quadruple expansion steam engine. Her engines were rated at 3,170 NHP, producing a speed of 18 knots. The ship was officially launched on the 27th of January in 1906, boasting a variety of specifications, including a required crew of 373 and berths for 1,542 passengers and 4 classes on 7 decks. On the 15th of May 1914, the Empress of Ireland set sail from Liverpool en route to Canada, captained by Henry Kendall. 13 days later, she would depart the French-speaking region of Quebec for the return leg of her journey. And, tragically, she wouldn't make it home. On the early morning of May 29th, a dense fog would descend upon the waters of the St. Lawrence River. With visibility proving almost impossible, many were oblivious to the fact that, heading straight towards them, was another ship, the Norwegian collier SS Storstad. As the early morning hours passed, the majority of the 1,057 passengers, 138 of which were children, as well as the 420 crew, were sound asleep in their beds before disaster struck. It all occurred east of Rimouski, which is located in the Bas-Saint-Laurent region at the mouth of the Rimouski River and near the St. Lawrence's south shore, where the river opens up. The Empress had made a short stop to drop off a pilot at Father Point District and was not far from the shore. Oppositely, the SS Storstad was drifting up the coastline, en route to collect her pilot for its subsequent journey towards Montreal. At 2:00 a.m. on the 29th of March, both ships spotted each other in the distance. Captain Kendall calculated that the oncoming vessel was approximately 8 miles away, thus providing him enough of a time window to ensure a safe passage. As he navigated the ship accordingly, the fog became extremely thick, engulfing both ships in its eerie cloud. With visibility fading, Captain Kendall blew his whistle 3 times to signal to the ship ahead that the Empress would initiate her engines full astern. She would slow down to minimum coasting speeds. However, the bow continued to point in the direction that Kendall had proceeded to take from before, in the hope that the ships would pass safely, albeit within close proximity. Unfortunately, his hopes were short-lived, as within a short space of time, the mast headlights of the SS Storstad were beaming directly into his eyes and to the Empress itself. The inevitability of a collision was upon them, and there was nothing either captain could do about it now. In a last desperate attempt to mitigate maximum damage, Kendall ordered his pilot to make a sharp turn to the starboard side, in the hope that the stern of the ship would sway far enough away from the Storstad. This quick thinking helped alleviate the force of the crash, as they slammed into one another with little shudder. Hoping that this was enough to prevent disaster, Kendall took stock of the impact. However, the bow of the Norwegian liner had, according to James Crowell in his book 14 Minutes, Last Voyage of the Empress of Ireland, had gone between the liner's steel ribs as smoothly as an assassin's knife. Due to the silent tear in the Empress's structure, many people on board would have remained asleep, unaware that water was flooding the cabins on the starboard side. Tragically, these would be the first to perish. Those on the upper-class cabins were most likely to survive the overwhelming surge of water engulfing the ship as, after she listed starboard, the portholes began to fill up with the deluge, despite maritime law, which requires them to remain closed during transit. After 10 minutes, the Empress jerked and fell onto her side, where many of those on board held on for dear life. Within 14 minutes of the crash, the Empress of Ireland had sank. 1,012 died, including 840 passengers, 8 more than the Titanic and 54 more than the RMS Lusitania. It also included 124 of 170 members from the Salvation Army, who were en route to London for a conference. In total, 217 people survived the horrific event, but only 4 children managed to escape with their lives. So who is to blame for the occurrence that fateful morning? According to the first mate of the SS Storstad, the Empress of Ireland disappeared after her navigational lights faded into the vastness of the fog. They did not wake their captain, who was asleep at the time of the moments leading up to the collision either. The first mate and other crew members present at the time claimed to have seen the lights briefly, which would indicate that the Empress vessel's port side was showing, therefore beckoning their ship that she had turned to pass them to the port side. The men claim that this did not sit well with them initially and tried to push forward in the blinding fog in the hopes that they would squeeze past her without impact. They positioned the collier starboard, which was the wrong decision in the end. Captain Kendall, who survived the ordeal, despite being thrown from the ship's bridge before she began to sink, continuously blamed the crew of the SS Storstad for negligence, furiously declaring, "You have sunk my ship," after being rescued by the collier's team. Unfortunately, no one knows for sure whose negligence, visibility, or decision-making was at fault for the disaster that occurred during those early morning hours. Numerous theories began to circulate amongst the maritime community, but nothing was fully confirmed. What we do know is that the design, structure, and capabilities of the SS Storstad made her a dangerous obstacle, to say the least. Her longitudinal bracing was intended to puncture and push through massive ice blocks. Therefore, on the day of the disaster, she pierced the Empress of Ireland below the waterline at a depth of 25 feet. This left a hole that measured approximately 14 feet wide, which made her sink rapidly. Those authorized to dispatch lifeboats were unable to launch them in time to save the lives of those affected upon impact. Where exactly does the blame lie? Many believe it was simply the fog itself. Unfortunately, the tragic events that befell the Empress of Ireland, and indeed the SS Storstad, were overshadowed by the fallout of the Titanic's sinking. Despite its capabilities, fast transit time, and functionality, the Empress was not a particularly famous ship, and with the First World War looming, many would quickly forget about her. As with all maritime disasters or sinkings, a commission of inquiry was put together to discuss the events, technical issues, and decision-making by the captain and crew members to ascertain what happened that morning and who was to blame. The commission was chaired by Lord Mersey, who also conducted investigations and hearings into the sinking of both the Titanic and the Lusitania, and was held in Quebec City. After much deliberation on the case study, the commissioners came to no other conclusion than that it was the Storstad that ported her helm and changed her course to starboard, therefore responsible for the collision. Chief Officer Toftness of the Norwegian vessel that was specifically criticized and condemned for heedlessly altering course in the fog, as well as failing to call the captain when the fog descended. The sleeping captain, Thomas Anderson, was quoted as saying that Lord Mersey was a fool for holding him and his crew responsible for the disastrous crash, that he would file an official lawsuit in his defense. So what became of the Forgotten Empress nowadays? She was relocated during the mid-1980s by divers and currently resides 130 feet below the water surface. Although she is within appropriate reach for scuba divers to access, the St. Lawrence River is 34 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer, along with rapid tidal currents, can severely limit visibility. Due to the awkward angle that the ship rests upon, the starboard side of every interior room is buried, along with all the items set loose as she sank. Some divers have managed to remove the bones of more than 1,000 people who died when the Empress of Ireland plummeted to the depths of the river. Since 1999, the wreck of the ship has been marked with a white buoy and designated a historical and archaeological property in Quebec law. This protected status prohibits any intervention or retrieval of artifacts from the ship, ensuring her protection and respected prominence. However, diving excursions of the wreck are still permitted as long as divers adhere to the regulations outlined in the Cultural Property Act. The Empress of Ireland Museum at Pointe-à-Pied was constructed near to the wreckage and contains numerous artifacts and materials salvaged from the ship. The popular tourist attraction educates visitors on the history of the liner, the dives in the wreck, the testimony of the passengers, and their descendants, as well as an immersive reconstructive show of her last voyage. The story of the Empress of Ireland is tragic for many reasons, not only for the loss of life, but the fact that such a disaster could have been easily avoided had intuition and more professional heads prevailed. Though attention has been brought to the wreckage site in the form of diving expeditions and the aforementioned museum, at the time, the Empress was quickly forgotten due to the shadow of the Titanic and the fears surrounding the First World War. Hopefully, this episode sheds a light on the events of that day and pays respect to the Empress, her crew members, and to those innocent souls who lost their lives.